Welcome to another of our podcasts recorded at the Rockwool Foundation, Berlin, where I am talking to some of the economists who are creating the next edition of the Handbook of Labor Economics. My name is Tim Phillips. Crime has an impact on the economy, so it's natural that economists should research it. Stephen Machin of the London School of Economics is one of the most innovative thinkers about the economic impact of crime on society, and also about a relatively new area of economic research: the impact of crime on its victims.
There's been a huge increase in the amount of economics of crime research over, I guess, the last 20 years. I'm speaking here about, in a Handbook of Labor Economics conference, about a chapter. So since the last chapter was written in 1999 in the handbook, there's been a huge upsurge in the amount of economics of crime research, and in particular for what I'm speaking about at this conference, about crime in the labour market and crime in education and the consequences that follow from questions about that. I mean, there are first-order questions in economics about that have been around a long time, about what might make individuals on the margins of crime perhaps do crime. And shifts in the returns to legal work and the returns to illegal work are key to that. And so that's been around for a long time, but there's been a lot more empirical tests, particularly of those kinds of questions more recently.
Yeah, the incredible observation that came out of this years ago was that crime is another way to make money and that people will move between crime and work. It's counterintuitive for a lot of people.
To some people, there are income returns out there. It's uncertain. You might get caught if you participate in some kind of illegal activity to try and steal something, burgle a house, or many other kind of examples you can think of. Then there is some income that can come from that. And jobs are what give you income. And so you can think about crime as an occupation that can give you some return in the labour market. And so, of course, one of the critical questions is, if the labour market isn't doing very well, will that make people switch to do crime? One of the more fragile relationships in the literature has been the impact between crime and unemployment. Some crime is done by people who are in work as well. Some crimes don't take that long to do. And so you can combine crime and work if you so choose.
Now, I want to talk to you about the other end of this today, which is the victims and what we know about the effect of crime on the victims. We've seen some more research about this recently, haven't we?
There's still not that much out there, but one key feature of the economics of crime research has been access to much, much better data, much more comprehensive data, often from administrative records, either from the police or from register data in some countries, which enables you to look at broader questions. So it's actually true, the kind of orthodox economic model of crime is relatively silent about victims. I mean, you might be even led to think that crimes are victimless, which is clearly not true. Many crimes have victims in them. And so more recent bodies of work have started looking at what the consequences of being a victim of crime are. I guess there's two strands in the research that I've been talking about. One is, does it have an impact on the labour market? Does it have an impact on your employment or your earnings? Or perhaps psychological consequences of you being a victim of crime? Maybe you have to take sick leave, so when you don't earn, or maybe if you qualify for sick pay, you get that. That may not necessarily be your full earnings rate. So there's work there. And of the studies that have been done, there's a handful of studies using very, very rich data, often from the Scandinavian countries where the access to the registered data has been very prevalent. But there is a bit of US work. There's a bit of UK work, certainly since lockdown occurred, thinking about what happens to victims of domestic violence. There was a lot of focus on that when people were staying at home a lot during lockdown, for example. And the literature seems to find that it's pretty bad for people's job prospects and their earnings. And not only does it have a negative effect on that, these effects seem to persist. And so it isn't just short-run effects that occur. It seems to be persisting beyond the short term. The other side of things that's been looked at is whether people who are victims of crime or have been close to things that have occurred, like the commonly cited in the news, in the media, school shootings that have occurred in the US, whether children who have been exposed to those, whether that has a detrimental impact on them. And there's evidence out there that their education has suffered and perhaps their psychological well-being in some cases as well.
Can we argue that economics is late to this? Other disciplines have been researching victims of crime for quite some time.
You might do. There's been quite a lot of work in sociology and psychology looking at that kind of question, studying victims of crime, often from self-report victimization surveys. And so the more recent economics research is sort of trying to find causal impacts of victimization on subsequent outcomes, which is not really studied in most disciplines. They're very descriptive for what they do. They have a much better framework, and most of the crime structure there, the theories there, would emphasize that many crimes have victims associated with them. What I would say is actually, I think with the kind of quality of data that's becoming available and with access being granted to it in certain settings, I think this interaction between both perpetrators of crime and victims of crime is going to be on the research agenda for economists in future. There's been big developments about social networks and thinking about interactions between individuals in economics over the last few decades. And I think this is a prime area that I could see being on the research agenda for the future. It's a highly policy relevant one about the way in which perpetrators and victims would interact on these things.
You mentioned that there are large results and long-lasting results. Can we put some numbers on that? How big is the difference in earnings? How big is the difference in your performance in the workplace if you are a victim?
We're not talking about absolutely enormous effects, although maybe if you accumulate them up over several years, they might be. We're talking about 2, 3, 4% perhaps of earnings. You can imagine if you have to take a few days off, that could happen. I mean, the bigger consequences are when people have to leave their jobs because of that. And so, of course, that will be much bigger in terms of income losses.
And you did mention that there were higher levels of intimate partner violence and domestic violence around lockdown?
There's some evidence of that for fairly clear reasons about people staying at home and people not being on the streets. The composition of crime changed a lot during lockdown, and it hasn't necessarily bounced back to what it was before. Well, I guess many people are still adjusting from lockdown anyway, and with long COVID being around and so on. So domestic violence was one issue that certainly received more attention, and it's also been received much more attention in the economics research as well. There's some outstanding work that's coming out in some of the top journals about this now, and it really wasn't on the agenda for economists to study this before. I think it was deemed the area of other social science disciplines and indeed medical disciplines maybe.
Absolutely. You mentioned that this is highly policy relevant. From what we know so far, and I accept that we're still finding out a lot about this, from what we know so far, does it suggest any policy remedies that are not being taken?
Well, I think there's two things of relevance to that. When people have tried to estimate the economic costs of crime, they have factored in psychological costs to the victim. But we didn't have much evidence about what the magnitudes actually were. Right. So, of course, hopefully this research will shed more light on that and improve those calculations about what the economic and social costs of crime are. And then the policy response could follow from that would be, I suppose, if they're much bigger than they were before, that would suggest that combating certain sorts of crimes that have these additional, if you like, spillover effects from them, because the crime event occurs and then it affects other outcomes for people involved, in this case the victims, in the future.
One of the problems when we think about crime is that there is maybe sometimes a gap between what the research tells us and what is politically feasible or what is advantageous to politicians to promise and to talk about. With this new research, is there an opportunity to close that gap?
There should be, because if we can have improved estimates of the costs of crime and we can study better what the benefits of crime reduction are, then we ought to be able to calculate the cost-benefit ratios better, and that should inform policy.
Stephen Machin, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. The Rockwell Foundation Berlin Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work is providing new knowledge to inform public debate and to create the best possible basis for policy making. Find out more at rfberlin.com.